Organizations like the World Bank and FAO can be supportive for them for develop these tools and the building in capacity in the countries for this governance assessment and monitoring. In fact, the World Bank and FAO are already collaborating with countries and other organizations in the development of generic set of indicators of good governance in forestry that could be used by countries as a basis for the development of their own more country-specific indicators. Much can be learned from various international, regional, and country initiatives related to strengthening forest governance. For example, the FLEG initiative process. These lessons should be taken into account when developing tools for monitoring RED governance. It should also be taken into account that in many countries there already exist methodologies for monitoring, assessing the biophysical and socioeconomic aspects of forests, and we would propose to integrate as well governance aspects into these systems, as it can be easier and most cost-efficient than developing a own monitoring system for governance. In fact, FAO is doing this in the frame of UN RED in Tanzania and other countries by integrating forest governance aspects into national forest monitoring assessment. And on a world scale, we are planning to strengthen this governance part as well in the forest resource assessment for 2015 on a global scale, as a comment. Another aspect that we should not forget is that governance problems are usually not limited to the forest sector, and that corruption is a problem that goes far beyond forestry. Therefore, it is important to collaborate with anti-corruption and other related initiatives. Before closing, I would take the opportunity to thank all the speakers for their engagement in this learning event, and particularly the World Bank for the excellent collaboration of organizing this event. I would just add for your indulgence that I will have to leave in 5 minutes due to the promise to be in the press conference, as this event, the Forest Day 4, is also a communications challenge, and time is very limited, but I will join you later on and share from the discussions.
While we get the PowerPoint in order, I just want to let you know of a slight change in schedule. The order of speaking is not going to be as is listed here right now. Instead, after I do the keynote, I would ask Dr. Kuntoro to speak next. And after that, Tuka Castren would be the second speaker. And finally, Ajit Roy would be the last speaker. And we will try to ensure that we have a little bit of time towards the end for questions at the very least. So I'm going to talk today about forests, governance, and outcomes, and really try to reflect a little bit on what exactly it is that we mean by governance. Initially, I'll say a little bit about the importance of governance and what is governance, and then discuss different actors of governance and mechanisms of governance, and provide some evidence on how different mechanisms of governance are associated with outcomes in which we are interested, particularly livelihoods of people who depend on forests, forest carbon and carbon storage, and biodiversity. Towards the end of my talk, I'll present a framework for thinking about governance and a few concluding messages. So when we look at a wide range of studies today around environment or on environmental issues, the idea of governance and the importance of governance is repeated in study after study as the thing that is necessary for achieving better environmental outcomes. Governance has become a kind of buzzword that people use to talk about improving environmental outcomes. Forests are no exception. Their fate, and in the context of the current COP, that of a global climate response, is supposed to hinge on better governance. So what exactly is governance all about? Is it about policies, coordination, institutions, organizations, or is it about ownership and property rights? The Nobel Prize winner from last year in economics, Dr. Elinor Ostrom, in a paper in Science, said that no single type of ownership, government, private, or community, uniformly succeeds or fails to halt the major resource deterioration as shown by forests in different countries. So governance if it is just about ownership and property rights, is clearly not sufficient to manage improved environmental outcomes as relates to forests. Is it policy? So governments in different parts of the world control roughly 75 to 80% of the forests, and their policies have clearly protected forests in many ways. But it has happened that protection has happened through the effects of policy on other actors, organizations, and behaviors. Policies are thus only one part of the picture. So what exactly is forest governance? And there are three elements of forest governance that I want to emphasize. Very briefly, processes and mechanisms that policy actors use to influence behaviors and outcomes with regards to forests is what can be called forest governance. So there are three key components of forest governance: actors, mechanisms, and outcomes. Who are the actors? And broadly, there are three major actors: governments, civil society actors, and market actors. And this figure gives you a very rough sense of how different actors involved in governance connect with each other: state, community, and market actors. Cooperation between state and community actors is often called co-management. That between state and market actors or companies is often called public-private partnerships. And that between community organizations and market organizations, such as companies, is often called private social partnerships. And I have some examples for each of these. And when there is cooperation among state, community, and market actors, which is not as rare as one might think, one could call it multi-party governance or hybrid governance. And if one thinks about these different actors in the context of forests, there are these three major actors control pretty much all of the forest area on the planet, about 4 billion hectares. And 75% of them is controlled by state or government actors, 12% or half a billion hectares by community actors, and another 500 million hectares by market actors or by companies and private actors. So this is as far as different actors involved in governance goes and their interrelationships. What are the different mechanisms of governance? And often when we think about mechanisms of governance, we talk about institutions, but in fact there are other mechanisms of governance that are equally or often as important. The first of them is information, and one area in which the importance of this mechanism of governance comes across very quickly is that around certification of forests. Better information about forests or about specific forest products helps people make decisions about which forest products to buy. A second mechanism of governance is incentives, and this is embodied in payments for environmental services, and most efforts at payments of environmental services pay more attention to refining the kinds of incentives or the conditions under which new incentives would be delivered than around institutions. And case also for RED, RED+, and RED++. A third mechanism of governance is investments, and this can be seen in terms of road building or national plantation programs as far as forests are concerned. And finally, or last but not the least, are institutions, and these are familiar mechanisms of governance in processes of decentralization and co-management. So just very quickly, a little bit of evidence on each of these four mechanisms. The Congo Basin Forest Partnership at the international level is a partnership among 40 government and international organizations. And one of the major things that it has led to is more information about the forests in the Congo Basin. And this new information about the extent and distribution and ownership and forest cover in concessions and protected areas in the Congo Basin has clearly helped reduce corruption and increase transparency. But it is still unclear to what extent this increased information, increased transparency, and additional and lower levels of corruption have led to changes in forest cover, or to what extent changes in forest cover in the Congo Basin can be linked to higher levels of information. Investments, roads are a prime example of investments that governments make for improving the levels of income or for development in countries. And there's substantial evidence of deforestation associated with roads, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Central Africa, and Latin America. And mostly these are the places from which we have evidence about a positive, strong association between roads and deforestation are countries with low population density, limited restrictions on logging, and low levels of enforcement on whether there is illegal logging or not. There is also some positive evidence on the building of roads and levels of deforestation. That is to say, low levels of deforestation go together with high densities of roads. And most of the evidence for this pattern comes from South Asia, where you have higher population densities, stronger restrictions on logging, and also higher levels of enforcement. So roads can have both kinds of effects on forests depending on the context in which the roads are getting built. What about evidence on institutions? There are two. I want to draw on examples of two countries, Mexico and India. And in Mexico, what we see is where you have high levels of community control, the positive policy environment with regards to community forestry use and management, long-lasting control by communities, and mobilization of community actors has led to positive carbon and livelihood outcomes in community forests. Interestingly, an example from India has almost exactly the same features. Positive policy environment, long-lasting community control, and mobilization of community actors has led, again, to positive carbon and livelihood outcomes in India, in the Indian Himalayas, and this is a paper that was published in PNAS last year. Global evidence on how institutions or local institutions can produce effects on forest conditions is also can also be drawn from a study that was done for about 125 forests around the world. And essentially what this study found was where you have strong local enforcement of rules, you have lower levels of deforestation and higher levels of regeneration of forests. Second study, which is looking at how governance, local level governance affects carbon and livelihoods, finds that larger forests or larger community forests are associated with higher levels of carbon storage and higher livelihoods. Greater local autonomy is associated with higher carbon storage and higher livelihoods, and community ownership of forest land is also associated with more carbon, but interestingly with lower livelihoods. Finally, some evidence on incentives or incentive mechanisms associated with governance through payments for environmental services. There has been a lot of discussion of payments for environmental services over the last decade or decade and a half. Clearly, schemes related to payments for environmental services are highly adaptive. They have been used for many different contexts. However, the evidence from existing studies on how PEZ schemes work and what they lead to is somewhat unclear, and it is mixed. There are clearly some prominent success stories, both from Costa Rica and from New York State. And one of the essential features for the success of payment for environmental services seems to be conditionality. That is, establishment of a baseline and delivery of payments in response to additional improvements in the outcome or goal that is the case. It is also the underlying basis for RED, RED+, and RED++. So what do these different examples say about governance? One, actors and mechanisms interact to influence behaviors and outcomes. So it's not just actors, it is not just mechanisms, it is the interaction between the two. Governance mechanisms don't exist in a vacuum, so if you think about roads, they produce different effects depending on the context in which they are created. And finally, different combinations of actors and mechanisms have different forests and governance effects. And I'm going to present a framework that brings these different points together, and it might look somewhat complicated, but basically the three parts of this framework are actors on the left-hand side, mechanisms in the middle, and the interactions between actors and mechanisms produces the outcomes in which we are interested, depending on the conditions in which these interactions occur. So this may seem like a very complex figure, but it represents how some of the key policy actors and mechanisms come together to produce forest and forest governance outcomes. And despite all the research that has occurred on forests and on forest governance, there are a number of areas in which we still do not understand how governance works and what relationships or what outcomes it produces. So for example, we don't know what forms of ownership, private, community, government go together or go most positively with which forms of governance or which types of governance mechanisms. The effects of these different mechanisms under different social and biophysical conditions remains still to be understood better, and the effects of different governance mechanisms on different forest outcomes still need far more work. There are some areas of knowledge, and I will just highlight two of these given the amount of time we have left. One, that local governance mechanisms and partnerships, including with civil society organizations, contribute to different kinds of positive outcomes from forests. Finally, it is essential to combine different mechanisms to ensure positive outcomes. It is insufficient to rely just on institutions, or just on information, or just on investments, or just on incentives, and hope to produce positive forest outcomes in multiple dimensions. What are the implications for REDD++? Successful architecture of REDD++ programs and policies will require partnerships. Although the discussion on REDD and its variants has been dominated by policy and advocacy, when governments implement REDD policies and projects, inattention to the strengths and capacities of actors and the potential of different governance mechanisms is likely to promote regrets. And I want to end with just one or two small points about complexity in thinking and working on forests and forest governance, which is that it is often said, and I have heard it repeated in many different contexts, that decision makers don't have time for complex messages. One must produce simple answers for decision makers. And if that is true, I must confess that that is unfortunate, because although it is very important to make decisions, pursue policy targets, and advocate for particular goals, and do it as quickly as possible, action without knowledge is like a sword in the hands of someone who cannot see. Finally, theories should be as simple as possible, but no simpler, as someone we all know said, and he might indeed have been speaking about forest governance. Thank you very much.
It's a real pleasure for me to be here in front of all of you to share my views, my observation with regard to governance. Well, especially because, especially since I was the head of the Aceh Reconstruction Agency that has the mission to recover Aceh after it's devastated by tsunami in 2004. And we've done it in 4 years' time, and last year the President of the Republic officially closed the recovery operation and restructure this agency that I was heading. Excellent presentation by you, Arun. I really enjoyed it, and I share with your views, and everything there is valid and something that can be implemented immediately. I just want to put into perspective about my country, Indonesia. Some of you were there in the plenary session when I delivered my presentation there. But to be very clear is that Indonesia has a population of 220, maybe 230 now, million people, with an income per capita around 4,500. Unemployment rate is around 10%, 9%, 10%. Poverty, 12%, 13%. And we want to have an economic growth rate of 7% by the end of 3 years from now. Such a way that by having this economic growth of 7%, the poverty rate can be reduced to 8%, and the unemployment rate will be around 6% to 7%. So that is the things that we are dealing, and we want a new policy. Then that is climate change, and especially the REDD+ program to be successful. When the President officially announced that Indonesia wants to contribute 26% of emission reduction by the year 2020 with its own resources and with the support from the international community, it can reach 41%. Actually, attached to that is a policy by the government to discontinue what has been practiced before, especially with regard on how do we manage the forest. In years before, forest is seen as a resource in which you cut trees and you get revenues, simple as that. And it's been like that for 30 years. And the structure of the government, the legislation, the behavior and the attitude and the bureaucracy is consistent with that policy. So between 1970 to 1998, that is the policy. Our forest law was stipulated in 1971 or 1969, around that area. So it was 40 years ago. Now that we changed the policy, and that's a national policy, and our president, President Yudhoyono, is really determined to implement that policy. To put that in place and effective, that change, that the huge change should be done in the way we not only manage the forest, but also how do we manage the development. And when it comes to managed development, at the end of the line is poverty, unemployment, and we all know that there are so many versions about how large is still our forest. One agency mentioned around 131 million hectares. Another say that's around 95 million hectares. Well, it depends with whom you're talking. And if you ask more detail on that, they can come up with something that is believable. But knowing that even in one government we have so many maps about forest, so many versions, then the first question that you want to answer is, where's the reference? A reference in which there's a high integrity that you can start all this activity to achieve the goal in climate change. So these are the real challenge for us. So we are now dealing with how do we restructure the way we manage forest and environment. As I mentioned about maps, Ministry of Forestry have their own version. Even in that one ministry, some say that there are 3 or 4 versions. Ministry of Environment, they have their own version. Ministry of Agriculture, you get confused with that. But we have to have one. And this map is only the bottom line of a superstructure that's been there for 30 years and supporting the policy in which forest can be exploited. The second is the legislation. There are many legislation that's produced within that 30 years. So if you want to change this, then you have to start changing from the legislation. And that's not easy. People say that there's so many corruption in that. Corruption, yes, we agree that there's corruption there. But if you go and follow the legislation, then some of these bad practices started from a legislation that was produced 40 years ago that allow that kind of action to be taken. And even there is no consistency inside the law. So these are the things that you really have to rectify, to harmonize. So these are the superstructure that we have to rectify, to improve, to support the new policy. That's a very big endeavor, and we are now in the process of doing it. It'll take time. But at the same time, we are determined that we already signed a letter of intent with the Norway government, and the government decided that by next year everything should start to be implemented. So that's a good start, basically, since that means that the president at the highest national level of policy in Indonesia already decided that you don't have to wait for the legislation, but you can start immediately with all this program that's inside that LOI to be implemented. And that consists of, we are having now the RED Plus strategy, and that's very important. By having this RED Plus strategy at the national level, that means that all actors should follow that strategy. Well, there are some loopholes, since when it comes to legislation, there's something that can be used by them for this people who wants to continue the deforestation process, to have a legal basis of their wrongdoing. The very important phase in this whole line of governance is the enforcement. You can have a good legislation, you can have a good structure, but when it comes to enforcement, it's weak. Then no matter how good your superstructure is, when it comes to the ground, then you will see nothing is happening. And that is something that we have to be very careful with. We are preparing the MRV, and that's the basis of everything that's active on the ground should follow a certain rule. And based on that MRV, we can see the progress, or if there's no progress, what to do about that. So basically, these are the things that we are now doing there in Indonesia. Aside of this agency that we have to set up, this agency is the one that will coordinate the RED Plus program in Indonesia, and all ministries that's related with forest, including those supporting the forest, like the land use agency, agriculture, infrastructure development, will be coordinated by this special task force. And by having this one central body in the central government, then hopefully everything will be done in a very coordinated way. But again, this agency, in the very long run, should be seen only as a transition agency before it becomes a more formal agency. And this formal agency in the government should be based on the new legislation that we have to draft starting from today. Well, let me stop here, and glad if there's any response or comments on what's happening in Indonesia. Thank you, Arun.
My task here is now to give some observations and some comments from development organizations, and especially from the World Bank's perspective on the topic. And then thirdly, RED, of course, it creates a huge demand, an opportunity and challenge for forest governance. But the thing we have to think carefully is that how much does RED actually change the way we approach forest governance? And there's lots of talk on governance for RED, but sometimes it appears that we speak of three different things. We speak about three different things when we talk about governance for RED. First, we have the management and administration of RED schemes at national level. Secondly, we have the international RED architecture and the compliance of various international regulations. And then third, we have the impact of forest governance, of generic forest governance on RED outcomes. They are all important issues, but somewhat different, and we should be very careful that we are clear about which dimension of governance for RED we mean when we discuss the topic. But in this kind of an environment, what could be the response from international development organizations? And once again, I'll give three observations from our current activities. First, we need a strong analytical basis for policy development and implementation. In the past, we have very often worked and focused on symptoms, and we haven't had the kind of systematic across-the-board approach on governance challenges. But if we aim at the genuine transformational change in the sector, we have to have better understanding where we come from, where we stand, and what needs to be done. And like we heard from Eduardo in his opening remarks, the bank, together with FAO and some other key partners, are working on building a forest governance indicator framework and toolkit so that governments, civil society, and private sector and various bodies and various stakeholders can really analyze in a specific context what the status of forest governance is and where the reform options really lie, and what are the root causes for potential governance failures, so that we wouldn't be only working on the symptoms. And secondly, like I think Arun, you made a reference to information management in your presentation, that we need better tools to collect and manage information. And I strongly believe that the modern information and communication technology provides us very good tools and opportunities for improving forest governance. And this is an area where we should be doing more stuff. And if we compare, for example, to the hugely rapidly growing rural finance sector, where sensitive information is transferred through mobile phones, and nobody's worried about the integrity of information. So one could say that if we build the right applications, we can easily have 3 billion independent forest monitors reporting forest crime through the mobile phones. And thirdly, we have to recognize that a governance is about legislation and about consultations, but it's also about investments, that we have to spend money on improving governance. The forest administrations need capacity building, both in physical and human infrastructure, and the communities need capacity building. It takes money, and only through these development investments we can really achieve governance improvement. I was recently in Liberia, which has in the past 5 years or so gone through a tremendous policy reform process. They have written new legislation, and I think the legislation is in very good shape. But it was evident that the necessary investments in the public administration or in the communities had not been done, and the outcomes were perhaps not as good as one would hope as a result of this very deep policy reform process that has taken place there. So if we look backwards, and when governments and the civil society about 10 years ago recognized the issue of illegal logging, it was for many governments, it was very, very difficult to admit that they have a problem. And it was the same thing for the bank as well. We spoke about undue rent seeking and irregularities in the forest sector, but words like forest crime or corruption were just not in our daily use, and it was very difficult for us to recognize the problem. But I think now the situation is totally different. And if we look at, for example, the RPPs coming from FCPF and UN RED processes, effectively all of them make strong references to forest governance. So the issue and the challenge is widely recognized and accepted that something needs to be done. And there is one potentially tremendously powerful process going on, and I think that's the clearest example in the change of global attitude is the new legislation in number of consumer countries to ban trade in illegal timber. And the timber regulation by EU and the amended Lacey Act in the US have made it a crime to trade in illegal timber. And I think that the EU legislation and the VPA negotiations are perhaps the best example how things have changed. In VPAs, the producer countries and a major consumer bloc have jointly agreed on rules how to define, how to monitor, and how to verify legality. And they are unique in a sense that the EU accepts the producer countries' assessment of legality, and then the producer country also opens its own processes for EU to inspect. So it's based on mutual trust and recognition of mutual interest. And we often think that forest sector is kind of conservative and we are slightly behind all the other sectors in reforms, but this is an innovation that at least I don't know any other sector where producers and consumers have jointly built this kind of verification systems, perhaps apart from the Kimberley process for diamonds, but in other sectors we don't have similar mechanisms. Of course, there's a long way still to go. Emerging economies like India and China, we have to encourage them to apply similar legislation. Domestic timber is not covered by the legislation, but I think these consumer country reforms very strongly demonstrate that there's a global interest in improving forest governance. So, like we heard from Pak Kuntoro, it's not enough that the systems are there, but it's an issue of implementation as well. And even if our target is to ensure that forests are well managed, and it's also very important that both the legislation and its implementation is socially just, and that we recognize that nobody gets penalized only because of being poor. But in that kind of cases, we have alternative livelihoods, and then the enforcement focuses on the real criminal minds. And now I turn to Ajit, who knows the criminal minds better than I do.
Well, I'm going to speak on illegal logging and corruption and the challenges it poses to RED. I would like to make 3 points. First of all, we need to understand the nature and the complexity of illegal logging. Secondly, I would like to say that law enforcement officers like the rangers, police officers, the anti-corruption officials are key stakeholders as far as RED is concerned. So when you make RED strategies, you have to consult them. And RED also gives you the unique opportunity to bring in the much needed reform in these agencies. The third point that I'd like to make is that to get to the bad people, the bad systems, or the abuse of power, there is no easy solution. The solution is going back to the same principles: criminal justice reforms, human rights, gender justice, access to justice. These are the things that we should try to achieve. Let me go to the first point, the nature and complexity of illegal logging. Well, if you go into the forests of, let's say, Indonesia, you'll find small groups of youth, 3 or 4 of them with a chainsaw. They are cutting down trees. They cut about 3 trees a day or 4 trees. They size them, take them by boat, and sell them locally. they get about $3 a day for what they do. There are medium-type groups who cut many more trees. They pull them by rafts, by tugs and boats, and sell them to sawmills, which is then sent off to different cities. There are much bigger organizations, multinationals, which are carrying out these operations at much bigger level in concessions given by the government, in which they cut wood, which they're authorized to do, and they also cut wood, which they're not authorized to do. And we do not know the extent to which illegal logging is combined in what these big companies do. They also hold big oil, palm concessions, and such other things. In Guyana, the biggest companies that that log are the ones from South Korea and Malaysia. And these are the same South Korean, Malaysian, and Chinese companies that operate in Indonesia. They are the same that operate in Papua New Guinea. So you can see that distant companies, companies with distant operations and taking wood to different parts is what constitutes part of the illegal logging problem. But this is only part of the problem. That is the supply side. Now there is the demand side. EU and Asia are the biggest consumers of wood. And there is a study which says that nearly 45% of the wood that goes into EU and also to China is illegal. Now there are very big global operators in this. Criminal gangs are involved. There are big brokers involved in all this. And what is surprising is government is also consumer of illegal logs. I was surprised by Kuntoro when I went to Pontianak, and there is a road that goes from the airport in Pontianak, which is in West Kalimantan, Indonesia, to the city, 30 kilometers long. And since the soil there is very loose, it has been bolstered by logs of wood. And all this wood has come from the illegal logging. Pakuntoro was in Aceh. Huge amount of development took place after the tsunami as part of the reconstruction, but there was heavy demand for wood from the forests of Aceh during that time. Let me go into the problem of corruption now. Illegal logging is also very much related to corruption. The countries with the best forests are also those which have the lowest ranking that the Transparency International has given them in their transparency, the Corruption Perception Index. In the 2010 index, Brazil was ranked 69, Indonesia 110, Tanzania 116, Papua New Guinea 154, Guyana 116, Mexico 98, Congo 164. Well, this wood, timber, or sawn wood, which is huge, which has to go in trucks, how does it pass? This wood will not pass unless there is the connivance and corruption in the police, in the rangers, in military. The army is involved in many places. There is also the connivance of prosecutors and judges. You see that conviction rate is very, very low as far as forest crimes are concerned. Again, those who are convicted are the boat drivers or the chainsaw operators. The small fries are the ones who are caught. You have provision for big prison sentences, but always you see that conviction rate is very, very, the conviction is, the sentence is really very small. And then there is also, when money is made, money laundering takes place. Accountants, lawyers, bankers, foreign governments that offer safe havens are all involved in this if you go deeper into this. Well, I would like to say that when the red payments start, that is a very big chance that there would be corruption in that. In fact, that is highly possible. Now you have all these carbon cowboys who come and make the red pilot projects in many countries. In Indonesia, there are over 100 of them. Like mushrooms in the forest, they've come up. Very secretive, in a very secretive way. They involve the local government, involve 1 or 2 NGOs, and then suddenly come up with a red pilot project. This kind of secretive projects that come up has already sown the seeds of corruption in it. Let me come to the second point that I want to make, and that is that law enforcement is a key stakeholder. I've seen the National Red Plus strategy of Philippines, of Indonesia, but in this one, it doesn't really seem that there has been adequate consultation with the law enforcement agencies. In the Philippines National Red Plus strategy, there is one paragraph, there is one whole chapter on governance, but really there is only one very small chapter that talks about enforcement of the law, and nothing at all on working with the law enforcement agencies, nothing on working with anti-corruption agencies. So this is something that needs to really go into the National Red Plus strategies. Another point that I'd like you to consider is also, you talk about incentivizing incentives under RED. Can you incentivize good law enforcement? Again, RED should be looked at as an opportunity to frame good laws and policies and a good reform agenda within the forest law enforcement and governance. This is a unique opportunity. If you are going to implement the RED policies or the RED national strategy with the old structure of forest rangers and forest laws that you have, it is bound to fail. So you should look at it as an opportunity to reform what is there. Finally, how do you deal with the bad people, the bad systems, and abuse of power? Well, firstly, I would like to say that the role of the civil society is extremely important in this. Civil society can play the role of a watchdog. In the Papua province of Indonesia, two NGOs, the Environment Intelligence Agency from Britain and Telapak, a local NGO, were able to secretly film the illegal logging operations that was going on. And they showed it on the national television, after which there was huge operations in Papua. And after which the illegal logging has come down to a very large extent. Shows that NGOs can play a very, very important part in this one. NGOs can play a part in public education, can involve more and more people to participate in what is being discussed. They can involve the marginalized group, the women groups. And we need to work with the law enforcement agencies. They need training. They need advanced trainings on how to collect better intelligence, what to do. Like, for instance, I was visiting one of the forest offices, and there was huge quantity of wood seized. But then I asked the question, where are the vehicles? And the officer said that we release the vehicle in 10 days because we have no place to park the vehicles. If you don't take any action against the vehicles, and the same vehicles then go back and again start doing the same illegal logging operation, then what is the disincentive to the illegal loggers? So there has to be a system in which not only you seize the wood, but you confiscate the vehicle, you prosecute the driver, and then ask him questions on who is behind it, and then go. There has to be a logical conclusion to the cases that you take up. And it's not simply that you just train them, you have to equip them. There need to be the vehicles for them to go and patrol the forest. There need to be checkposts. There need to be the other kind of wireless systems or GIS and all the modern things that you require. It's really important that you equip the law enforcement officers with these. Now, in order to check corruption, it is very important to work with the anti-corruption agencies. Anti-corruption agencies in terms of investigation of illegal logging, investigation of the corruption behind illegal logging. You need to work with the financial intelligence unit, and in order to see that, in order to trace where the money goes. It's not just that law enforcement officers chase the wood, but then you have to chase the money and try to recover the money, and only then can you go and find who are the big operators behind illegal logging. So working with the financial intelligence unit is also equally important. And similarly, the audit agencies also have a very big role in checking forest crimes. Well, in the long term, you want the trees to stand for a very long time. You want to avoid long-term deforestation, but for that you have to go into the basics, like I was saying: criminal justice reforms, human rights, respect to human rights, women's rights, access to justice. All these are very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the time that you have taken from your busy schedules to be on this panel. I think we have a little bit of time left. Of course, like Ajit, I can't see anybody in the audience either. So if there are any questions, let me step down here. So I'm just going to pass the mic and yeah, is it? I don't know. Can you illuminate the audience? Can you put the lights on in the audience? Why don't you ask the question?
This question is primarily for Dr. Castron, but I would love to hear from the rest of the audience or the panel as well. I was intrigued by your comment about the need for funding for local development in order to improve governance at the local level. I was wondering how much discussion you feel that there has been in the RED negotiations about that kind of funding, including funding specifically for local governance support and development.
Yeah, actually that's a good idea. Why don't we collect a few questions and then.
Thank you, Prof. I'm by name Robert Bachika. I come from Uganda and I'm a student in Makerere University. I just want to highlight some few comments and also give one question. We are talking about legislation, we are talking about human rights, we are talking about all these instruments that governments have to do. I just want to share one example with my government in Uganda, what it has done, where almost all these institutions are in place. Even they have undergone numerous forestry reforms. Professor Aran, you can agree with me. But the issue of enforcement of some of these is still lacking. And when I've followed up the discussion, the equation of balancing the reality side and the ideal side of logging is not addressed. Many of us are talking about the same songs of human rights, we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about all this, and governments have done this, but the degradation is still taking place. However, FAO say deforestation has now gone down. But we are not addressing the issue of why people are degrading forests and why people are still doing all this sort of work. I think the panelists need to give us some of these highlights other than trying to remind us of the same issues we are already discussing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I please ask everybody to keep their questions as short as possible so that we have a little time for the panelists to respond as well.
Good afternoon. I grew up in the city of Chicago, Illinois, sort of a poster child for lawlessness and corruption. And so I must say that the suggestion that the people who are deeply corrupt institutions should be treated as a stakeholder and negotiated with baffles me. I think we need a little more elaboration on that thought.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Parag from India. I am basically Indian Forest Service officer, and I like to raise a very pertinent issues related to the community participation in conservation of forest, as mentioned by Mr. Arun in this presentation in Uttarakhand. It's basically a historic thing and a very traditional way of people participating in the conservation. So if the Grid Plus goes in a convert into an agreement, it's very pertinent to have this community participation and their incentives in the Red Plus, because it's very basic. It works on very basic principle, that's give and take relationship. If people gets incentives, then and then it will go into work in long term on a sustainable basis. So that's a very good thing. The people should get incentives unless it is going to fail. The second point is regarding the illegal felling and all. It's a very important issue to you highlighted here because it's many areas where it's very difficult to stop this kind of illegal operations, and they are basically the major cause of leakages of carbon, because it's unnoticed and it is not going to record, it's unrecorded. So if you add this mechanism of mechanism in the red agreement, it's always good to have a kind of basic agreement over how we can control this kind of illegal operations or illegal unrecorded logging operations. Thank you.
Rod Harvington, Panellists London. I think a lot of people would agree that getting secure land tenure, verifiable land tenure, is a very important first step for RED to be able to work. In my experience, the process of getting that land tenure secured in the first place, when you don't have it except in a verbal fashion, for example with community forest lands, opens up opportunities for corruption by petty bureaucrats who are doing the registration. I've come across this in Madagascar and other African countries. I'd be interested to hear what your comments are for that, because I know that the World Bank, for example, has also had its own trouble in that sector. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I just want to address about the local capacity investment or financing that inside our national RED strategy, we define what are the things that should be done by the central government, should be done by the local government, such that there is a synergy between central and the local government. We have altogether around 34 local government at the province level. But when you go into the district level, then it will reach around 540 districts. Well, it's a pretty tough project if you want to cover all of them, such that we have to be very specific and focus on areas that is really directly related or a high impact on forestry. So in that national RED strategy, we define what should be done. And for instance, the MRV. At the national level, we have an MRV facilities. But in the local level, we also have to have this MRV facilities, either at the province or at the district level. Now, how do you support all these facilities? Well, that's part of the government budget that will be used to develop that. But also, we are open if there's any support coming from other countries. Let me be specific on this. Australia has been helping us at the national level to provide us with carbon accounting mechanism. And this is something that's really important. But again, when it comes to the local government, they also have to have this kind of facilities, not competing with the national level, but they have to be complementary with this. This is something that we are preparing now. We haven't come up yet with something that is really specific. Where do we get the resources? But the most important at this time is how do we specify which should be done by the local government, which should be done by the central government, and which should be done together in a complementary basis. Thank you.
Very, very good questions. And I'm afraid I can address only a few of them. First, following up on the local capacity issue, I was telling that I was in Liberia, and there we visited one community which has a 10-member community forestry development committee, which has 10 members, and 8 of them were not able to read or write. So the capacity building starts from the education sector that very fundamental issues have to be tackled. And that's one of the reasons why we have to remember all the time that we have to move beyond the forest sector. That really look at the whole, should I say, rural landscape and what kind of issues there are. And all of them have an impact on the interactions between communities and forests and the forest governance. And that applies also to the issue of corruption and in land registration processes and so forth. It's the integrity of the land registry system per se that's an issue. So it's once again it's beyond the immediate forest sector. We have not yet seen the country investment programs coming from a forest investment program, FIP countries. We just have to hope that those investment funds are also used for this very local level capacity building. We don't know it yet. That's something to be seen. But of course, FIP has also this special initiative for indigenous peoples, which hopefully also addresses the very local level capacity issues. Why the gentleman from Uganda asked that why people still, despite all this, still degrade forests. I think it's very much to do with, and that's of course the fundamental question in our business. It's livelihoods issue. That what are the sustainable livelihood strategies for the communities, and that's if the incentives and opportunities are not right, that leads to degradation of the environment. But there is no silver bullet to answer that question.
Well, I'll just answer this gentleman who asked the question. If the law enforcement is corrupt, why should you be consulting with them? My answer is, if you have a headache, you don't chop off the head.
Thank you very much, Ajit, and Dr. Kantoro. I think we have enough time to collect one more round of questions before we break up for the panel. So if there are more questions, I'm happy to pass along the mic.
Hi, I'm Caleb Gallimore from Ohio State, and there's been discussion about basically two levels here. There's a centralized level at the national policies, and then localized levels with mobile phone initiatives and law enforcement reforms and that sort of thing. But there's a big gray area in between that, at the province level and on up. So what do you do? How do you link up those two different scales into an effective system?
Hi, thank you for an excellent conversation. My name is Richard Donovan with the Rainforest Alliance. The comments on the international trade and the brokers, it's a really tough dynamic to get at them. So I wonder if you have any pointers in terms of the best way. The legislation passed in Europe and in the United States is helpful, ultimately, but oftentimes it seems like it's very difficult to do that. The flip side of that problem, the other question I had is that most forest products in most countries stay in country. And so that the value of Lacey or the timber regulation is for the, in many cases, the export market. So it seems like there needs, the fundamental leadership. Is there any substitute for change at the head of government or something like that to make this really change? Because it just relying on the trade mechanisms does not seem sufficient. Thank you.
More questions?
Yeah, I just wondered if the Indonesian government's ambitious goals for development in the palm oil and pulp sector might in fact encourage illegal logging, and if there's any evidence that pulp or palm oil plantations in the past actually benefited from CDM mechanism or financing. sorry. The first question was if the government's ambitious goals for pulp and palm oil production might actually wind up encouraging illegal logging. And second, if there's any evidence as suggested that palm or pulp projects may have received actually CDM or development financing in the past. For the doctor, yes.
Hi, my name is Crystal Davis. I work at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. My question is for Pak Kuntoro. I was wondering if you could tell us how Indonesia is planning on engaging with its anti-corruption agency and law enforcement as a part of its RED strategy. Yes, sorry. I was wondering how Indonesia is planning on engaging with its anti-corruption agency and also law enforcement as a part of its RED Plus strategy.
Well, let me first invite you to the thinking. When I mentioned about this new way in developing the economy of the nation by having this tree standing instead of be cut, then actually you're talking about a very complicated process. You start from the legislation up to the enforcement on the ground. But if you are determined that you really want that, and at the same time you can find a way that the welfare of the people in general, and especially those living close or in the forest, can be improved, then you're in a good position. Now the question is, how do we get to that? That is something that's really important. If by having all this development, pulp and paper, palm oil, timber, wood processing, that kind of things, by doing that you are better off than keeping the tree standing, then for sure the people will start cutting the tree again. That's the fact of life. So that means that when it comes to dealing in maintaining this forest, that's not only our effort. It should be supported with the international. If this tree coming from Indonesia, from Papua, go out to EU and to China, and those big money coming from these countries to Indonesia and keep on bribing our police and the military, and the rate of bribery is increasing from time to time, and we cannot stand this, well, for sure the law coming from our forest will always be flowing to outside. So this is something that we have to have a good cooperation between the international community and Indonesia. How do we do that? So that's a big question, since from our side, from my side, I'm the one who's dealing with all this government structure restructuring, government restructuring, power and authority reallocation among ministries, dealing with the local government. Then somebody has to come up with a good solution on how to make a good relation between our domestic effort with the international effort. The push from the international will be difficult to stand if there is no cooperation. When it comes to pulp and paper and palm oil, we want them to move to swap with the degraded land. Well, how do you do that? As a policy, it's nice to have that, but when it comes to implementation, that's not really easy to do that. Well, we have to think about a way in dealing with this kind of things. The most important thing is we have an inventory where the degraded land are located and where are the palm oil estate are located, and how do we swap between them, and where's the legislation to do that. This is something that is very important, and this is our homework at the highest list in our homework. So these are something that we are dealing with. And the last question from the World Resource Institute is related with the anti-corruption. Yes, we are dealing, and we have a good cooperation with our Corruption Eradication Commission. And actually, a week before my trip to this place, we had a meeting, and they come up with an identification. Where are the problems at the legislation, the procedure, the business process, and also the manpower, human resource that's necessary to be improved in order to avoid this kind of negative illegal logging crime in the forest to be continued. So we had a very good cooperation with them, and they come up with a proposal on how to solve this problem. Thank you.
Right. The gentleman, I think it was from Rainforest Alliance, asked about the Lacey and VPAs and versus domestic trade, and he's absolutely right that the consumer country legislation by definition applies only to international traded wood. But there are a couple of things that we have to recognize. That first, that tradable or traded wood and legality verification there is a kind of a first step in a stepwise approach. It covers only a segment of the timber volumes, but still it's there. It gives an example of a well-regulated logging. And it also, at the same time, it builds something, should I call it, legality infrastructure, chain of custody, clarification on what's legal and what's not. So we have all the ingredients for improved legality also for the domestic timber. So basically time will tell, but we have to trust that there is a positive spillover effect from the internationally traded wood products to domestic products as well. But of course it varies. It will probably vary a lot depending on the structure of the timber market. If, for example, same products are both consumed domestically and exported, then it's likely that the spillover effect will be higher, whereas possibly the spillover effect to, say, fuel wood will be very small because the markets are totally different. Yes, it's absolutely right that it's not the kind of the end of the story, but I would still argue that it's definitely a positive step forward.
I think it is probably time to bring the session to a close. We are at 5:10, and I can hear people outside, and I'm sure you're also eager to join your friends outside. Thank you very much for coming. A big hand to the panelists.